Hello, welcome if you're joining us live or watching this on catch up. I'm James Hadley, Executive Director of Musical Theatre Network, and you're joining us for a discussion about musical theatre and environmental sustainability. For audio description, I am a white male in my late 40s with very, very short, bristly hair and beard, wearing a black and white stripy t-shirt against a very blurred out background of my kitchen, and my pronouns are he, him. I am going to invite our wonderful panel of four to introduce themselves with similarly an audio description and just very briefly the organization or their relevant experience. And then we're going to have a discussion, hearing some initial thoughts from each of our panelists, leading into a wider discussion about environmental sustainability and areas where musical theatre creatives and the musical theatre industry can engage. Before I get our panelists to introduce us, just a couple of very brief bits of housekeeping. We will be inviting any questions or discussion points you want to make if you're watching us on live stream in the second half. By all means, if you have a question that comes to mind as you're listening, do put it into the live stream chat at any point, and we'll put that to our panelists in the second half of the conversation, but you can type it in at any point you like. Also, just to mention that next week, next Thursday, the 3rd of October, we have our next online event at 7 o'clock next Thursday. We have an online panel talking about general management in musical theatre, and a brilliant panel of that if you're able to join us for that, I do recommend it. That's next Thursday at 7 o'clock. So without further ado, I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves and with a bit of audio description of how they appear. So over to Jess, first of all.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jess Taylor. My pronouns are she, her, and for the audio description, I am a white woman in my early 20s with jaw-length blonde hair and wearing a green shirt against a red and white background. And thank you so much for having me today, and I'm very excited to be here. I am currently working as the sustainability consultant at Birmingham Hippodrome Theatre and also building up a portfolio of freelance work, working on productions and venues sustainability.
Amazing. Thank you, Jess. And over to Malaika.
Hi, my name is Malaika Cunningham, pronouns she, her. For the audio description, I am a white woman with dark hair. I am sat in my kitchen wearing a blue jumper. And I run an arts company in Yorkshire called the Bear Project, and also I'm a fellow for the Centre for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity. And my work is kind of at the intersections between academic research and participatory theatre. Yeah.
Amazing. Thanks, Malaika. Over to Jessica.
Thanks, James. Hi, everyone. My name's Jessica Edwards. My pronouns are she, her. And for audio description, I'm a middle-aged woman with dark hair, wearing a white top, green and blue sleeveless fleece, and I've got hoopy earrings. So yeah, that's what I look like. In terms of what I do, I would say that I'm a cultural strategist, an executive producer, and a coach. And I work at the intersection of climate and storytelling and change making in a multiplicity of ways.
Amazing. Thanks, Jessica. And over to Finlay.
Hello, I'm Finlay Carroll. I am got a mousy brown hair. I am wearing blue and maroon top, which I found out today is Aston Villa colours, which I wouldn't have known. And I've got a silver chain around my neck. I'm a white person. My pronouns are he, him. I currently work at Birmingham Hippodrome coordinating their new musical theatre department, which is the first in-house musical theatre department in the UK. We focus on developing new musicals, producing them, presenting them, and working with writers and artists to develop their work, both in Birmingham and further afield as well. Alongside that, I run a theatre company called Scatter, which focuses on developing new musical theatre with a queer or ecological focus. So really interested in combining musical theatre with climate activism in the ways that I can.
Amazing, thanks, Finlay. And yeah, that's the intersection of today's discussion. Hopefully, you're joining us because you're involved in new musical theatre, either as a creative or working at a venue, producing, perhaps engaging with new musicals. So we thought, as I said before, we'll start with some initial thoughts from each of our wonderful speakers, who I know have thought for copious amounts of time from different angles about environmental sustainability and about climate change and societal changes that we all hope will happen in response to probably the biggest crisis facing us. But we do hope this will be a very empowering and optimistic conversation, something where we're focused on solutions and adjustments and changes and provocations and inspirations that we can make as creative people, to help shine a light on steps forward for ourselves and others. So initially, we're going to share some initial thoughts, and the discussion will grow organically from there. I'm going to invite Jess Taylor to share some initial thoughts first of all. So the floor is yours, Jess.
Thank you very much, James. So it's an honor to be starting this discussion. I'll just start by walking everyone watching this through my experience in sustainability, how I came to be here, and what my particular interests are in relation to music theatre and the environment. So I have come into sustainability work from an academic background. I've been at university. I did a master's degree this past year focusing on global sustainable development. So that has really influenced the kind of three-pillar approach that I like to take to my work, which means that I love focusing on a diversity of different ways of understanding sustainability, with a focus on environmental factors for sure, but also on the economic factors which allow those environmental or impact those environmental factors, and also social sustainability with a particular heart for the social justice mission, which I feel is really at the center of sustainability work. So I started there, and throughout my course, I began working in an exciting placement with Birmingham Hippodrome, looking at everything sustainability. So that was a tall ask, and it's been a bit of a learning curve for sure. But I also think there's a very exciting opportunity which has been unearthed through that partnership in terms of looking at wholesale sustainability in a theatre environment and what that means to a venue, to a organization which is interacting with the local community a lot, to a leader in lots of ways in business in a city or an area, and also to the actual productions and programming that happens within a theatre or a theatre organization. I think at Birmingham Hippodrome, there has been an opportunity to focus on a really wide variety of things. This has meant that we've started with a very practical approach to sustainability, which reflects my experience of sustainability and also the interest of the venue. So that means starting with what everyone thinks of as your first ideas about your impact on the environment, which is things like your energy, your waste, your resources in a building. And that's been challenging, but also a great experience in that there is a lot to do, especially in a building which is as complicated as a theatre and also has such a public duty and compulsion to be really open and accessible to the people around it and the community that it interacts with in a multiplicity of ways. And so that's been a challenge, but also there's been great opportunities to immediately start seeing the impact of some of the work we've started to do improving the building, and also to start looking at the long-term impacts that could have on the physical environment that we exist in Birmingham. Alongside that, it's been really exciting to start getting involved with some of the production, communication and audience-based work. So I really have a heart for getting in contact with audiences and getting them engaged with sustainability. And that's been something great to focus on, because I do think that in practical terms, as well as more kind of cultural and socio-economic terms, your audience is really a large part of your impact as a theatre organisation. And as theatre producers, we have the really unique opportunity, as I'm sure all of us know, to influence the hearts and minds of the people who come to see our productions. And so whether it's through the language and the content of a performance, whether it's through the physical environment that it engages or exists in, or whether it's through the kind of external things like the publicity, I think there's such a great opportunity we have as theatre makers to really communicate important messages. And some of those can be, and I think should be, about the environment and the world we live in and the impact we have on it. I've also, as I said, been really excited to get involved with a lot of our communication work, which does come back to that audience aspect, because it's really important to talk about what we're doing when we do sustainability, because there is a huge educational gap when it comes to this area. I feel very privileged to have been able to study it in detail and learn a lot about it, but not everyone is in that situation. And indeed, by educating the people around us, we can not only improve their practice in the workplace, but also hopefully have an impact on their lives outside of work. And I think that's a really exciting area to get involved with. And now that I've started freelancing, also working in theatre sustainability, I'm really excited by the real variety of things there are to be worked on in this industry, and also how many passionate people there are out there already working on this and trying to bring themes or ideas about sustainability or the environment into their work. So that's really exciting when it comes to something like a musical theatre production, because there are so many ways that you can impact sustainability in the production itself and in the people who interact with it. And that's something I'm really excited to keep exploring in the future. So that's a little bit about me.
Amazing. Thanks, Jess. It's a brilliant introduction. And I'm sure we're going to circle back across some of those territories. I thought rather than going 5 minutes through, speeding through the panel, we'll just have 5 minutes now to sort of respond and ask questions in relation to that from Jess. I mean, just to kick us off, Jess, I wonder if in terms of, in your role, it sounds like you're juggling that balance between a lot of venues engagement has initially been through Julie's Bicycle and the Arts Council focusing on sort of carbon footprints and looking at reducing waste, like you were saying. Are you finding we're in a different place, like now that you're at a specific venue and looking at how Birmingham Hippodrome, as one example, is engaging with that thing? Are they in a different place now than they would have been in the past in terms of how they place that sort of reporting to funders and so on about reducing sort of very measurable sort of outcomes? And how is that separate completely to the creative conversations that you were mentioning later on, or is there a link between those? I'm curious, where do they sit in different parts of the organization? Or
I think it's all very interconnected, which is exciting, but also a challenge to overcome, especially when with any production or any venue, you're working across so many different teams and individuals to make one large thing happen or achieve one larger goal. So that can be a challenge because it really takes a lot of work to filter your goals through the organization. But when you get to that point, you also have such a dedicated group of people that there's lots of opportunities to make meaningful change. In terms of reporting, I think that is something that has been important to sustainability in the kind of general understanding and global perception of sustainability so far. And I think it's valid. I think there's a lot that reporting can do. And indeed, one of the things that I would say to anyone watching this is that your first step is just to get an account of where you're at. In my opinion, it's so helpful to figure out, even if it's not necessarily a positive or beautifying reflection of what's happening at the moment. I think it's so important to be able to genuinely recognize and assess the impact that you're having, whether that's positive or negative. I think the reporting frameworks, like you mentioned, Julie's Bicycle, used by the Arts Council, can be a really valuable way of doing this, but I do think that these frameworks are limited as measurement tools, and there is a lot we can do in sustainability that goes beyond that. And so I think we're in a very exciting moment where these conceptions of sustainability are expanding. There is room now that people, as a general statement, have a slightly better and increasingly year on year understanding of what it means to be more sustainable and to have more of an caring impact on our environment. I think there's now an opportunity to move that conversation forward. And I would say, in my opinion, that especially needs to move to those social, cultural factors, especially about who gets to engage with theatre, because it's such a wonderful art form. We really need to talk more, in my opinion, about the kind of a history of elitism in some ways that we need to reckon with within this industry, but also the ways that when we open up those doors to new people, there's so many new experiences and opportunities that we can showcase through our art.
100%. Any thoughts or questions from our other three panelists that you want to follow on there?
Yeah, I can jump in. Oh, go on, Jessica. Just really quickly to say that I think my perspective is maybe more on the creative side of developing work as opposed to kind of the production side of tracking stuff. But that idea of imperfection in the way that you're viewing your progress is really important, I think, for making sustainable change. Because a lot of people would start approaching the climate crisis as something that is a massive thing to comprehend. And as an artist, probably as someone that is more on the feeling end of the spectrum would feel that emotion, that responsibility quite heavily. And I think in a similar way that you would report on energy efficiency and all of these kind of statistics that go into running a building, you're also sort of reporting on yourself on like how effectively am I delivering my message and how effectively am I telling the story, and you know, you're sort of holding yourself to very high standards. And I think the key thing really is to just start doing it and start doing it badly, start tracking what you're doing, and then that takes away the pressure and actually allows you to be creative and playful and create better work as a result. So I think definitely the reporting side translates into having conversations with mentors, reflecting on the work you're doing, evaluating the work you're doing, thinking really clearly about the audiences that you're reaching, but also it relates into kind of giving yourself space to do the work and to start walking that path before necessarily you know where you're going with it. I think doing it will help you clarify that and take off some of the pressure.
That's a great point. Over to Jessica.
Yeah, Jess, it was really interesting to hear about your work, and I just want to kind of pick up on the point you made about engaging audiences, which I think is really important. And it's something that we can maybe unpack a bit further into the conversation. It feels a bit soon to be really getting into this, but I think it's important to recognize that there is no one homogenous audience, and there's lots of, I mean, I come from a world of working with television and film, and we've done a lot of thinking about different types of audiences, and there's lots of amazing work out there about different types of audiences have different attitudes towards climate change, and ways in which to kind of frame messages around climate really depends on who you're talking to. If you're talking to someone who is part of Just Stop Oil, you'd say very different things for that kind of very progressive audience to somebody who, you know, may never have, you know, thought about the climate crisis in any kind of particular depth. But actually, when it comes to culture and art form and musical theatre, it's an amazing opportunity for all sorts of audiences to come and convene. And it's about finding ways to talk about, you know, this big matter, big issue in ways that feel like it's holistic and people can join wherever they're coming from, but engage in kind of really meaningful ways.
100%. Well, I like Jess's point earlier about, you know, that it's not just reporting to the Arts Council, it's also shouting out to audiences and to the public about what you're doing. Someone, it was Will at Meta Theatre, who's done some consultancy work with MTN and MMD in the past around environmental sustainability. He said to us, oh, the fact that you've stopped doing a printed program for the Beam Showcase, rather than just doing it and saying to the Arts Council, look what we're doing, you should actually say that somewhere, you know, that it is for environmental reasons. There's no point. We were thinking just internally, oh, we'll do this because that would be a greener choice. But he said the whole point is to talk about the fact that you've made that choice for environmental principles, and to say that to other people in the industry as a way of having a dialogue about what's best practice. You know, that the more we talk about the little tiny, as Finlay said, the imperfections that we're sort of stumbling along, do we do it this way, do we do it that way, the more we have a dialogue about the little adjustments that we're making, the more they can become a dialogue about what steps we might next take after that, I guess.
I would definitely agree with that. And I'd say it's that consistency that's implicit in what you've said, James, and also what you said, Jessica, that is so important, because you can be blindsided by environmental messaging in a piece of culture if you're not expecting to see it there. And sometimes that provokes negative reactions, which can have the opposite effect of what you intended. Whereas if it's just these granular moves to engage with any level of audience or even partners who work with your organization or interact with your art, it starts to become the standard, not only within your work, but also within the industry. And that's where we start seeing change and seeing more openness to what that can bring.
Amazing. Brilliant. And we'll definitely, I'm sure, circle back round to Jessica's points about the speaking to different parts of the sector and different audiences, because I think that's a key thing, isn't it? The messaging. We're going to go over to Finlay next for your sort of initial 5 minutes of thoughts, Finlay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Jess. It's such a privilege to work with Jess at the Hippodrome and to like have that fount of knowledge to sort of collaborate with. So that was a really good first 5 minutes. I think I'll probably start again by talking about my own journey and the path that I've walked along to be able to sort of get to the point of being very kindly invited to speak at this panel. So I guess it starts at university when I was studying drama, and I also had a very keen interest in activism. And my specific interest in drama was in musical theatre. And I just felt like those two things were really far apart. And I didn't know how to sort of, I mean, we talk about audiences, but sort of communities. I didn't know how to bridge the community of my friends that love musicals with the community of my friends who are interested in activism or academia. But I sort of embodied both of those two things. So I did want to find a way to bring them together. So what we did is, as sort of the first step, was we applied for some seed funding from a theatre called Taunton Brewhouse to make a musical in a week about climate change. And this is what I mean about sort of imperfections and just taking like a sort of bold step to try something out for the first time. Obviously, you can't make a musical in a week, and what we made was quite scrappy. But what we learned through that process was some really key insights into making musical theatre about climate, which is be creative and be open, be specific in the characters that you're designing and the issues that you're approaching. Climate change is, and this is coming from a great theatre company called Ergon Theatre. Climate change is a hyper object, which means that it's a big topic. And if you want to make art about a big topic, then you need to break it down. So you need to sort of break it into smaller things. So under the umbrella of climate change, you have things like gender inequality, conflict, water scarcity, biodiversity, air pollution, like all of these little topics, which within themselves are actually quite big topics already. So during this week, we sort of stumbled across some of those topics which are in the news and ultimately ended up making them smaller and smaller until we found specific moments where characters that we made up but sort of came from our emotional heart engage with those topics in some way. And those are the ideas and the characters that have sustained into the future. And have formed the root of a show that we're working on now. But once that week was finished, we then went and moved sort of into a slightly different direction of creating musical theatre climate cabarets, in which we picked existing songs from musicals that engaged with ecology or the world in some way, and put them together into a cabaret that explored different emotions. So this was called Songs for Scattered Times. And I think what we learned from that again is the importance of being specific again. We gave performers an opportunity to sing a song that they felt related to some emotion that they were feeling about climate, and to say a few words before that song about how they related to it. And it was that relationship between the song and the performer that was always the most moving thing in the cabarets. The other thing was being more specific than just the climate cabaret. So we ended up doing one that explored queerness and climate, and that metaphor of queerness was a really good way for people to address climate. So sort of moving down from the hyper object of climate down to alternative sexuality and climate. So we did 10 of them, and we met lots of cool audiences through that, and we managed to sort of start thinking about climate. And actually, what I think we learned most from that was how climate exists in, and ecology exists in all sort of art, no matter whether climate change was defined as a thing when it was made. Like Sondheim, I'm not going to be able to quote stuff here, but all of these musical theatre writers always talk about the world, because that's how we understand human emotions, is through the world around us. People sing about the moon, they sing about the grass, they sing about the sky, like it's present in all musicals, the stars. So really what's changing now is not necessarily that we have to start talking about the world more in our music or our stories. It's just that, the world is changing, so the way we talk about the world is being affected by that rather than the other way around. So we sort of notice all of these links already that were existing. And then after that, we moved on to doing developing an idea from the musical that we started in Taunton, and that we found like that was going to be a supernatural musical, that it was going to explore horror in some way to deal with climate anxiety, and it all sort of came out of one character that emerged in Taunton. So I think that's where we've got to. We're developing that show now. I guess briefly through my work at the Hippodrome, I also engage with lots of ideas and musicals that explore climate in different ways. And the strongest ones that always seem to be the ones that have really clear character and really clear emotional arcs for that character. So the direction Scatter, my company, is heading in now is to develop original stories that are focused on humans and focused on humans dealing with change in their world in some way. And it's those sort of emotions of processing difficult things and really incomprehensible things and taking action that seem to be the most compelling narratives. And I think that's what we need to be putting out for audiences, no matter what the kind of context of the story is. The content needs to be about turning towards hope and action despite adversity, and bringing people with you in that fight. So yeah, that's kind of in my path. As I say, like I look back on some of the things we've done and I think, why did we do that? That was terrible, and that was not the right way to get the message across. But through doing that, I now feel more focused in what I can offer in this space, and I would encourage people to just get going, basically.
It was brilliant. Thanks, Finlay. And I love how the fact that we've gone from the sort of imperfection and that sort of almost concept of universal mercy or kindness towards that we'll stumble along the way, but that can coexist with a sort of climate horror and apocalypse, and the sense of that's quite cathartic as well. Sometimes to just give that sense of like, oh my God, this is a bit overwhelming, to give it expression. And then to pull back from that, okay, and what am I going to do? So everything's in that spectrum, isn't it? Just before I hand it over to the others to if you have any further questions, one question I have, Finlay, is around the sense of characters sharing their individual journey. I mean, that really chimes in terms of the sense of particularly in musical theatre, the way we identify emotionally so strongly sometimes with the journey of a character, because the songs are giving us such an investment in their internal subjective feelings and emotions to such an intensity that I think we rarely see in some other forms of performance. I guess I'm curious about, the degree to which you're using characters as role modeling for audiences, or that sort of sense of people identifying with the character. How much does the character's journey ideally operate as a form of influence on the audience's thoughts for you?
Okay, I have a couple of responses to that. I think firstly, the really difficult thing to accept is that one musical probably isn't going to change the world, and you probably can't change everyone's minds with one musical. So I think that's why you sort of what I found really helpful is to sort of forget about that and to focus on sort of one character story, and making it more specific, you make it more universal. And I think one model that's been really helpful for me in understanding that kind of like emotional change is when I think what our experience of accepting climate change and being able to act on it kind of follows the sort of stages of grief. Like we process climate change, and I wrote them down because I always forget them. It's like we deny it, we're angry about it, we bargain, so we're kind of like, well, is it as bad as that? And what if it isn't? Then we get really depressed for years and years, and then we accept it and we take action. And this is a model that is sort of central to the Western musical. Like it's a character encountering something difficult, singing about it, singing what they long for, going like getting angry and then trying to find ways around it. Second act, and then getting sad and then accepting it and making changes, and that's what gives us that sort of catharsis, and songs are really good at providing that, as you say, James, that emotional insight. So I think that's a really helpful model, and it doesn't really matter what the character is experiencing. I think if they're going along that road in some way, then the audience will go along that road with them in some way, and that allows people to take action, hopefully, in their own life. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Malaika.
Hi, Finlay. It was really great to hear about your work. I think a lot about the intersections of art and activism in my own work. So it's nice to hear about the idea of making a musical in a week and the kind of rough and ready atmosphere that the cabarets sound like they capture. That sounds brilliant. And for me, there seems to be something really strong coming through that I find in when I'm making work as well that kind of touches on environmental issues, that it kind of feels like in some way it's about the artist processing what the experience of climate change is for you, and that always communicates with audiences, right? Like when we're going through something and we can try and communicate that. I guess my challenge is maybe coming from kind of more of a background in like Brecht and like Augusto Boal and Theatre of the Oppressed and that kind of background. I'm not a musical theatre person, although I do love musicals. Some of the really powerful stuff about their work is actually about like kind of withholding catharsis and alienating the audience and intentionally kind of showing them how shitty things are without, sorry, I've sweared, but I'm gonna swear, without resolving it. And I think that the empowering thing for the audience within that work, in my experience, is that they're more likely to go out there in the world and do something if they feel like it's not been resolved for them on stage. And I'd just be interested to see how you feel like you can bring, I mean, Brecht also did musicals, right? Like Threepenny Opera is a musical. It doesn't give you a catharsis though. Like it leaves you angry. And I think that sometimes we actually do need to leave the theatre angry, not full of like hope and optimism, because I think hope, it can be a really active and powerful emotion. And we absolutely need that. And we need to believe that there is hope in order to act. But I also think that we need to be angry. So I just like to know how you make people angry as well.
Well, I think, yeah, that's an interesting. I mean, that's the challenge is do you leave people with a message of hope or a message of fear? Do you tie things up? Because musicals, people want to leave a musical with a curtain call that's really happy. Like people want to dance at the end. So it's like, how do you create that sense of irresolution? Is that word? Not being resolved by the end. I don't know the answer, and I think that there's room for lots of different answers in terms of the work we make. I think there's room for shows that leave people feeling miserable, and so they have to act on this show, room for shows that make people feel really hopeful. And it's sort of part of that breadth of experience that will lead people to act in different ways. I personally think that that processing is really important. So even if you move from like denial to anger or denial to bargaining through your show, then that's a really good movement for an audience. So you don't have to get to kind of the point of acceptance with every show either. But I do hear your point. I think the way I currently feel, and maybe this says more about me than about like the work, is that I think we do need that sense of resolution in work, in the musicals that we're seeing at the moment, and that feeling of sort of catharsis a little bit, because we don't talk about climate in this country, and that sort of emotional processing that ends in feeling hope, I think, is really missing. So that's why I currently feel, but I also do see that there's room for different opinions on that as well.
So many interesting strands. I'd love to have more time to pick up on here. One thing to add into the conversation, it'd be lovely, both Jess and Finlay, before we go up to Malaika next for her 5 minutes. This is a love story. Do you want to share? I presume you've both been involved to a degree with This Is a Love Story as a climate engaged musical at the Hippodrome. But also, so just to hand it over to either of you to mention anything relevant with that and how that resolves or what that's about for anyone who hasn't seen it, but also to mention on Malaika's point about Boal and Brecht, a musical like Urinetown, where they were using a lot of metaphors there, but they were using very much the principle of irony and satire, where on the surface the musical might seem to be following all the formulas that a musical usually has and having a resolution, but it's very sad and it's very dystopian in terms of a city where everything is falling apart and resources are not there in the way people would expect them to be. And because it has such a playfulness with the way it uses irony, it's kind of happy and ironic and entertaining on the surface, but you also leave the theatre feeling quite disconcerted. And so you have both the surface thing of, oh yeah, we all had a standing ovation and it was all very happy at the end, but also you're troubled by the music and by the content. And I think there's something in bringing more of that Boal and Brecht kind of troubling underneath the surface. So there's satire and irony perhaps in some of our musical theatre to trouble the audience at the same time as to satisfy the catharsis perhaps. But that's another thing for discussion. Anything about This Is a Love Story from Finlay or Jess? Just in terms of that feels quite relevant to.
Yeah, This Is a Love Story is a new musical by Jack Godfrey and Ellie Coote that was with us in January. So we did a workshop performance at the Hippodrome of that show and invited audiences on in at quite an early stage to see some of the stuff. So I think that audience development is crucial for new musicals, but also crucial for work like this. And just to briefly say about that show, that's about a relationship between Earth and humanity, where it's sort of like full of like breakup songs and like romance songs between them, sort of personifying them, and exploring it in quite like a light-hearted way, but with some moving moments in the middle where they sort of the relationship turns. And I think what that does really well is it sort of provides a like a human perspective on the issue of climate change and allows audiences to emote with the characters as if they were humans. Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember how it left the audience. Like, would you say that had catharsis? Or was it happy or?
So I'm trying to think, Earth and humanity break up because humanity has cheated on Earth with the moon. And then there's sort of like a post-breakup meeting where they sort of talk about we'll try it again. We might try it again, but we have to get used to change. Yeah, I think the point that I would just reply to Malaika on is that this whole idea of sort of like the end of the world and the show finishing with the end of the world, like there, as you say, James, there's so much nuance in that of like, well, whose world is ending and in what way, and like, you know, which community is being affected. And there's sort of each show is very specific kind of intervention into that question, and you can decide whether you want that community or the character to have a successful ending, like a happy ending or not. But you're always going to step out the theatre and reality is still going to be there, and there's still going to be other communities that are affected by climate change. So I think there's like, yeah, it's about that kind of specific answer at that moment. But yeah, This Is a Love Story, Jack Godfrey and Ellie Coote, and hopefully there'll be more of that at some point soon. So yeah.
Hope so. It's a brilliant show. Over to Malaika now for your 5 minutes of thoughts. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So yeah, I'll just briefly maybe speak just a little bit more about my work before talking about a few thoughts I have for musical theatre. So my background is in a almost even split between like political theory and democratic engagement and theatre. So yes, I did an MA and a PhD in kind of political theory, social science. But what I was always looking at within my research and what I've kind of continued to do post PhD in both my research and my artistic practice is explore the intersections between environmental justice and sustainability, democracy, and performance practice, and maybe the arts sometimes more broadly as well beyond performance. And sometimes that looks like a show. So we toured a big piece of interactive installation called the People's Palace of Possibility over the past couple of years, which is a big geodesic dome that would turn up in places all across the UK and would be there for about a month. And we work with different artists and host big feasts in it and performance events and live music and things. And sometimes that looks like research projects and academic papers about democracy and sustainability. But what I spoke about at the conference and what I want to talk about again today, maybe develop it further as an idea, is for me, the sustainability is really deeply like wrapped up with how our society is structured, both economically and democratically. So you can't tease apart capitalism and climate change. Carbon emissions and every other type of environmental degradation that we're facing right now is pretty clearly a result of human activity that is underpinned by a growth imperative. So this idea that GDP growth is the main measure for the successes that we have in our society is actually relatively recent. It only really became like the main paradigm for a country's success in like the 60s, 70s. And at that time, it was always seen as like, we know it's not quite right, but I mean, like major political figures at that time, like Robert Kennedy, I think even Richard Nixon, not a left-wing guy, were pretty skeptical of what GDP growth was actually measuring, because it measures everything in society that's like an economic exchange, not just nice things. It measures crime and murder and all sorts of things as well, kind of wrapped into it. I think there's a Kennedy quote actually that's like, it measures everything in life except that which gives our lives meaning or value. And I think that that's a really important thing to remember, that actually we don't need to be governed by this. There are many other ways that we have been governed, and in some places in the world are being governed in ways that are not completely focused on economic growth as the measure of success. So if we acknowledge that we need to move away from GDP as a measure in order for sustainability to be genuinely pursued in our society, then like what does that have to do with musical theatre, right? And I think musical theatre is a really interesting sector to be looking at in the context of the arts, because there's a lot of private funding within it, and it is often a profit-driven sector, more so maybe than the type of theatre that I've got more of a background in, like a theatre of the oppressed, for example, which is generally always publicly funded and will never make any money. But if we're thinking about the commercial musical theatre sector, like how could we like so radically change it so that we're changing what we value, right? Like what if we really valued the artists instead of a profit margin? What if we really valued the artists and gave them a universal basic income? Or instead of the profits going to wherever they go, shareholders of some description, they were funneled back into making work? Or what if we really, really valued our audiences, not just in terms of giving them lots of entertainment, but also valuing them as citizens. So a lot of my work is looking at like the civic role of theatre spaces. I think that we've talked a little bit about, the role of venues and what they have in society, right? As being places for people to gather, maybe places for people to, in a joyful way, in a fun way, and in a playful way, investigate some of the issues that face our society amongst strangers. I think that that's a really powerful and important role that theatres play in our society. And also, what if, musical theatre really valued the environment, like really respected the materials that it is using and where that comes from and where that goes as well, right? Which I think that like environment, like in terms of like what we use and how we use it and how it is disposed of at the end, is really where our conversation around sustainability in the arts is at. That is where Julie's Bicycle has been at for Julie's Bicycle's existence. And it's a really important thing to say, how can this space reduce its carbon emissions? But I think that we have to acknowledge that if we're going to make the systemic changes that we need to make in our society pretty urgently. We need to not just be talking about how we transfer our stage lights into LEDs and how we recycle more. We need to be talking about how we actually change how we value our work and how we can move away from economic growth as the primary measure, fundamentally, of our work, which is still insipidly there. You know, we talk about West End transfers, we talk about, you know, global tours and all of those things. Kind of what we're talking about there is how much money have we made? So how can we move away from that? Can we move away from that? What does that look like? I'd love to talk about that more if people want to.
Absolutely. Any response to that? One thing, of course, it's so interesting, as you say, Malaika, that musical theatre is seen as a very commercial art form. And then we look at even the commercial end of musical theatre, 90% of the West End shows don't break into a profit, but 90% make a loss. So it's this bizarre thing of there's got to be the chance of making a profit to interest the investors within that commercial end of the art form. But then so many of the new musicals that MMD and MTN are engaging with are under no illusions that they're ever going to cover their costs, let alone, you know, pay the writers for the 9 years or so of writing that has taken, you know, the economics just don't stack up around the long gestation periods of musicals. So I was saying to Malaika early on that I think what's interesting about her sort of conversation about degrowth as a value is that I think so many creatives working in musical theatre are always operating from a non-commercial, non-capitalist value system, because in terms of capitalism, making a musical is a really bad idea. You know, it just doesn't add up for 90%, 99%, I think, of creatives. But further thoughts, what do people think? Any responses or questions in response to Malaika? Jess?
Yeah, thank you, Malaika. That was absolutely fascinating. And I definitely agree with you with a lot of what you said there. And that was a very interesting point also, James, on the idea of profit and how important is that when we're thinking about an MT show or something beyond that. Because a lot of the arguments against sustainability, especially in established or even both in established and in brand new burgeoning organizations, is the cost of it, the monetary cost. And sometimes you have different ways of imagining that cost in the way that you can imagine to counterbalance it. For example, balancing monetary cost against carbon cost and doing carbon budgeting is some of the ways people handle that. But it's always such a hard wall to come up against. And it's interesting to reflect on, James, when you say that there is not necessarily this profit that's going to be made. So how can we instead kind of justify investing the rest of that money on almost, you know, making more of a loss, but to make more of a win in a different way. But anyway, going back to Malaika's point, I thought that was very interesting what you said about how the interaction with strangers is a really important way that theatre kind of interacts with a lot of different people and gets them involved in the conversation. And that is, of course, inherent to when you go to the theatre. You might go with a friend or two, but largely you're surrounded by complete strangers, and then you kind of watch strangers or maybe personalities you've engaged with on social media, but not in the real world, in front of you performing something. And yet a lot of the time it becomes very intimate. So yeah, how do you think that has an impact on climate and the work you're trying to get across and communicate, Malaika?
Yeah, I think that point of like that in real life contact, and actually being with our like neighbors essentially in a space, having an experience is quite a powerful political gesture, I think. I guess my view is that democratic spaces are incredibly necessary in order for us to have the kind of functioning democracy that we need in order to face environmental crisis. So, and by democratic spaces, I guess I mean just that, places where people can gather to have conversations amongst strangers about how we live and how we will live into the future. You know, I think that we tend to think about democracy as like voting once every 4 years, but actually, unless we have a culture of democracy, where we're actually talking about issues with real people in real life, because I think online, you know, as we've seen, we can be quite anonymous, and issues that exist offline become kind of like hypercharged, right? So having these spaces that are necessarily live, like the theatre, are really important places for us to engage with each other and engage across difference. I mean, my background is in political theatre that is very like hyper interactive, and I know that musical theatre, you might not necessarily talk to the people that you're amongst, but I think it absolutely has a place in that ecosystem, particularly work that is about social issues in one way or another, which I mean most musical theatre that we're talking about today is. If it's not environmental, it might be social in a different way. As people are just having an emotional experience together amongst others, I think is like a really important part of democracy. And I think that we tend to think about sustainability as like a problem we can solve, like in one almost like political term or something like that. Like if we just made like Caroline Lucas the fascist dictator of the UK, then actually we could just solve all of our environmental issues, really. But actually, I think sustainability is a process. It's not a end specific goal. And I think we've been talking about that a bit already in terms of imperfection as well. And how do we embed our democracy with longer term thinking, with a sense of ourselves as political agents beyond one vote for, pretty similar political parties every few years? Like, how can we activate ourselves as citizens? And I think that the arts is an important place for that. Yeah.
Finlay.
I just like that. This is so interesting, and I feel like we could talk for hours about this. The idea of growth being the primary focus of our society, I think, is absolutely right, and that imperative for growth and how we measure it and how everything is sort of baked towards that. And my response would be that to change, like, capitalism is a story as much as any of the stories that we tell are stories. This is the right way to do this, and this is why. And if you do this, you'll have this feeling, and therefore we will all be safer and better. And the way to sort of change that narrative is to introduce new narratives and introduce new myths, basically. And like, how can you? And I think we have to be bold as people that care about the environment with this, because as Malaika says, I think it's kind of capitalism, or it's climate, like you have to pick, well, as in like, or climate action, like, and so I think that's why to achieve cultural change, because I do think it has to be a systemic change, but I think to do that, like the reason that's not happened is because people don't feel that that's right, and culture has such an important role in how people feel about their lives. So I think if you sort of go back from the need to change systems, you go back to need to change culture, and then you go back to kind of like how people feel, and stories that we make are really important in that. And I do believe that they have power in doing that. I also think if it's so unlikely to make a musical that makes money, or a musical that is successful, then why not just make the craziest one and just see what don't play it safe then. If it's so hard, don't play it safe. Just if it's going to take you 10 years, make it mad, and make it really drive it from the heart, because it is going to take a lot of your time. So that would be my sort of empowering call, is go out and make new stories that feel really true and bold to what you think and feel as an artist.
Absolutely, yeah. And actually, I mean, to come back to Boal again, just because it's very relevant, but he described his work as a rehearsal for the revolution. And I think that that's a really beautiful way of thinking about theatre and stories. That like it's really difficult for us to imagine an alternative within our society, mostly because like, and I won't get into Thatcher, but like we've been kind of told to not imagine alternatives, and that there is no alternative for a really long time. Generations of political theory has kind of told us that neoliberal capitalism is the only way that we can live. And the arts, absolutely that call of like, make it as wild and crazy and imperfect and strange and as you can, because we need to rehearse that part of ourselves, because without imagination, what chance does democracy have? What chance do any of us have to live differently? So yeah, let's use our theaters as spaces to imagine how the world can be different.
That's a quote from Hadestown. There you are. Imagine how the world
Right.
rather than the way it is. Yeah.
Brilliant. It's all there. And I think this is happening in the zeitgeist of musical theatre. The more we're seeing, also just thinking of the a theatre event, it kind of goes back to something Jess was saying earlier about theatres as kind of community spaces, and bringing the community in. I saw an article in The Garden recently talking about people's responses to the recent Nick Cave album, Wild God, and the fact that people that place themselves far, far away from organized religion are starting to just want something that's an equivalent to that, and how theatre often takes the theatre venues often take the place of a secular church for those who don't have an organized religion type spirituality. And it's interesting the role that musical theatre, with all its singing and dancing, has in the lives of people that don't go to church. It kind of has some of that kind of emotional homecoming, particularly super fans that might go to Wicked every weekend. It has a similar role in super fans' life as going to church regularly. So that's an interesting element there, I think, as well. But this is a nice segue, I think, from some of the things Malaika was saying there over to Jessica and your ideas. Let's send it over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Such a fascinating conversation. And I say that as someone who does not work in musical theatre, in full transparency. My background is in working mainly in television and in documentary film. And increasingly, it has focused on climate storytelling across those forms. And I guess I come here tonight really in the belief that storytelling, as Finlay's talked about, it's needed in all cultural forms, and it has a huge importance in terms of the narratives that are seeded in culture and how that then goes on to kind of create systemic changes at scale, and the kind of the role of new narratives are absolutely pivotal in that. So just to give you a bit of background, I spent 15 years making documentaries and non-fiction television, and then I came to a fork in the road, where I decided to diversify my skill set and my expertise. I work for a range of non-profits on a number of issues, in particular sustainability, and then I brought those skills back into independent documentary filmmaking. And I work for Doc Society, which is an international non-profit. And there I established a fund for climate storytelling, which funded into projects from all around the world, which was an enormous pleasure and an enormous privilege to work with creatives, mainly focusing on topics around climate justice, and that intersection of where climate kind of intersects and hits kind of social justice issues in a number of different countries, particularly in the global south. So since then, I've done a Claw Fellowship, and then I now work at Nesta for some of my time as head of cultural development and looking for ways to accelerate the organisation's 3 missions through storytelling. And there is a sort of sustainable future mission. So I'm still in the climate world, in the climate storytelling world, but through like working at scale at a systems level, which is kind of really interesting. Anyway, so my starting point today to this conversation is very much kind of aligned with the conversation so far, which is to kind of, what I'd like to do is just share a quote, which is like my North Star for my work, which comes from the writer Amitav Ghosh, who wrote this excellent book called The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable, which really is about the imaginative failings of modernism in the 20th century in the face of climate change. And he says this, okay, when future generations look back upon the Great Derangement, they will certainly blame the leaders and politicians of this time for their failure to address the climate crisis. But they may well hold artists and writers to be equally culpable, for the imagining of possibilities is not, after all, the job of politicians and bureaucrats. And I just think that this, just like Amitav Ghosh just nails it here in terms of the responsibility cultural practitioners have to be seeding new narratives, and have never ever been more important in terms of helping us all imagine new possibilities, to look beyond the present, and to kind of imagine the future that's to come, because it's very easy to kind of not really imagine or to assume the worst. But actually there's a kind of creative challenge here about getting beyond that into future worlds, which is kind of really intriguing and exciting, particularly when you think about wonder of the natural world, and potentially also hope as well in the face of some really big existential challenges. And it was interesting to hear Malaika's point on Brecht, and I really wanted to jump in, but we can maybe kind of come back to that, because I've been round the houses on this, and I have to kind of, I'm back on hope than I am on the doom, I have to say. But anyway, back on Amitav Ghosh, I feel that you know, it's easy for me to sit here, you know, as a non-musical theatre practitioner, you know, but I want to also acknowledge the complexities of the funding landscape, and the particularly knotty creative challenge that the climate crisis presents, and also the challenge of meaningfully engaging a diverse range of audiences in new narratives, because not all audiences want to engage in new narratives. We as cultural practitioners might want them to do that, but we need to bring the audiences to the cultural work as well. So there's something really interesting to think about in terms of the amazing work that's happening everywhere to mitigate the climate crisis, or to adapt us to the changing climate, both practically and also existentially. And I think there's a responsibility for us as cultural practitioners to interpret that and alchemize that and communicate it in ways that feel fresh and creative and extraordinary, and also accessible, which is something that musical theatre has an unerring ability to do, particularly through its emotional engagement and resonance, which is kind of really interesting, because it probably has more creative license in that respect than any other cultural form I've come across, which is like wildly interesting to kind of contemplate. And I've been really kind of intrigued to hear the mention of all these other kind of these work that Finlay, you've been talking about, climate cabaret, all of these things I didn't know about until this evening, and I'd love to kind of go and check them out. So yeah, I think it's less about climate change than musical, like as an on-the-nose interpretation, but more about the implicit or holistic existential opportunities to integrate themes of climate and the environment into musical theatre without spelling it out literally to audiences. It's interesting, in the world of television at the moment, there's a kind of conversation happening about implicit climate placement and like hiding it or bringing it in by stealth, for fear of switching off audiences. And then there's a kind of like the sense of the explicit, which is like the seeding of new narratives and making it a bit more obvious about where you're sitting. And I think there are merits in both. I honestly don't think it's binary myself. And you know, you can argue, given the constraints of television, perhaps the implicit stuff mainly makes sense. But I really believe in order to seed new narratives, there should always be room for explicit. We just need to think about whether the explicit narratives are going to bring the widest audiences to the culture, or whether we need to kind of reframe a bit in order to kind of take everyone on that journey. So yeah, so just to kind of wrap up, I think when it comes to musical theatre, there's an amazing opportunity to tell deeply affecting and deeply human stories in new ways. And that kind of may unexpectedly lend itself as a cultural form that could really profoundly engage audiences around climate, and some really unexpected audiences. I was thinking about some of the, you know, who would have thought there would have been musical theatre around a kind of an American chat show, or, you know, this is kind of, or a musical theatre around like a pet, like cats. It's just like, it's ridiculous to think that, you know, these things have become really big, like totemic cultural pieces, really, and have unlocked extraordinarily, you know, mundane subjects in some ways. So maybe there's something, you know, in there for climate as well. And I think, returning to Amitav Ghosh, he feels that there's something about the Indian epics that gives creative license to kind of access some of these metaphysical sort of areas that kind of tap into the natural world, into the sense of wonder, that made me think that maybe actually is musical theatre the perfect vehicle to be doing that, in terms of these huge, you know, this hyper objective kind of thing that kind of sits upon us. I don't know. I mean, that's my provocation, because I was kind of really intrigued to kind of, yeah, to contemplate it.
That's a great provocation. I mean, anyone who's seen the open, not to push Disney, but, you know, really commercial end of capitalism, I guess. But opening scene of The Lion King, I mean, that is definitely something that if that was just tweaked a little bit, could be the most, it's like Cirque du Soleil, isn't it? All this celebration of the natural world using the extremes of what human performers are capable of in terms of spectacle. It really does make you think. And jumping back to your concept of the implicit content there, Jessica, just to cross-pollinate, P. Burton Morgan, as a director and writer, has said in the past that they have a kind of commitment to, in every musical that they develop, they want to have characters that every musical they make is a climate musical. It's not on the topic, it's not in the title, but they'll make sure that there is content within dialogue or scenes or just within characters' behavior that operates as a kind of, there's just little bits of messaging in there that are just by the by, but that can be a discussion point, and it's a way, as you say, of it's almost like product placement, isn't it? That within the scene, people might not almost be aware that they're seeing messaging about more sustainable practices and people adapting their lifestyles. But it is interesting the degree to which that could really influence. If you're really identifying emotionally so strongly with a sort of superego character, and they're making choices within a scene about how they're going to travel to the other side of the globe, and they're doing it without using air travel, and there's something that it says in the choices they're making in that scene. So the opportunities to integrate in a sort of secondary way within things that won't put an audience off. But thoughts, responses from the rest of the panel to Jessica's thoughts there. Any questions? Finlay.
Firstly, they call it planet placement instead of product placement. A lot of people call it planet placement now, which I just love that.
That's great.
This idea of the implicit versus the explicit is so hard to square. I think that one thing, as you mentioned, James, is that we live in an era of climate breakdown now, like that is happening. So in a sense, like every musical is a climate musical. So those themes kind of fit into every story in some way, either in the production of it or within the story itself. But just to shed light on one thing that we're working on that we find that implicit thing hard is this new musical, which is called Pete Will Save This House. And it's about three characters, one who's a police officer, one who's a woman who hits a deer with her car one night and has sort of a supernatural haunting experience with it. And then the third is an activist who is sort of bordering on the edge of doing some actions that are quite violent or unsafe for herself and the people around her. And I think the really key and the hard thing is that we sort of approach this idea of being like, well, we want one character to be engaged in activism, but as soon as you introduce a character as an activist, I think there is a sense that audiences, especially musical theatre audiences, maybe would not be interested in that. And as I think Malaika said earlier, or someone said earlier, that it maybe would attract a sort of activist audience itself, in which case the story you want to tell to activists is probably quite different to the one you want to tell to sort of your typical musical theatre audience member, which is not to say that's not sometimes the same group, but often I think it's quite separate. And so we were thinking a lot about there's this sort of metaphor of the supernatural, and we're using genre to bring audiences in, and we're using sort of something that's quite familiar in terms of a ghost story to bring audiences in. But there's always this question at the back of our mind of, should it be that she's clearly an activist and she's billed on the script as an activist, or should it just be that she's a person and she happens to be an activist? And I think you've got to try and find a balance between those two things, and you've got to make the characters really complex and real and nuanced and flawed. And the best characters always occupy like a moral grey area where they embody both sides of the question that your work is asking. And so that's the challenge, is how can you spend enough time with the limited funding and difficult landscape that we're in to be able to build those characters to be really rich, so that when you introduce them as, oh, here's this person who really cares about this thing, rather than here's this activist, oh, they really care about this thing. Like, you've got to sort of do a lot of work to get there, and that implicit versus explicit thing is always going to be a really hard question. So yeah, that's a really good point to make, I think.
Absolutely. Thank you. Jess.
If I might hop in as well. Yeah, fascinating. Thank you, Jessica. And that implicit, explicit thing I've definitely experienced as an audience member and seen from behind the scenes. And it's a very interesting debate to be having. Something that I also picked up from your work, Jessica, was the fund you created as part of the documentary organization. And that sounds absolutely brilliant. But I think it also brings up the kind of wider theme of finances and funding that has been referred to throughout this discussion, because as Malaika has pointed out, the capitalism is intricately intertwined with the climate crisis we now find ourselves in. And as someone working in this area, you often have to ask the question of how can the finances help the problem they created? And when you're putting on a production, that can come down to questions as granular as, can we afford to do this thing in a way that's more sustainable? But on a wider scale, it also means that you have these issues where funding can be a limitation and an opportunity, and you really have to negotiate that, because from my own work in Birmingham Hippodrome, for example, we've found that there's funding for some of the things we want to do. For example, everyone talks about, I mean, the government, let's say, talks a lot about building retrofit and energy and resources, because that's an easy way to approach the climate crisis and how we can respond to it. Easy, I say. And so in some ways, there's a lot of funding to do stuff with buildings, which is really exciting. But if you're a theatre maker or an organisation that doesn't have a building, and instead you want funding to go towards a production or for employing someone who hasn't had an opportunity before in theatre, even as a measure of social sustainability, sometimes you don't get that option out there. And so you end up with a really sticky question of, how do we channel funds into this thing in an appropriate way that reflects the values we want to give? And also, is it even right to be making theatre in this commercial environment? And so, yeah, thank you for bringing up that point, Jessica. And it's something we all need to reckon with.
Yeah, no, I hear that completely. And I get, but one thing I would say about the funding, I think arts funding is really, arts specific funding is really challenging, but there are more new funding opportunities opening up, particularly around audience engagement, which, can create new opportunities and new pathways to bringing in different types of audiences into buildings, which kind of, I think it feels like there's a rule book that's being ripped up at the moment, and there's lots of new ways of doing things. And I think going back to Finlay's point about trying stuff, it's a kind of, I feel like creatively we're at a time where perhaps, even though it's funding challenge, we could actually all try new ways of doing things, and that there are some opportunities through the funding landscape that may help to support some of that, even though it's still complicated, and it's looking for those opportunities, because there are these little pockets of money to allow this innovation in some places.
Malaika.
Yeah, I think picking up again on that big funding question, which maybe we often skirt around in these conversations. I think that there's something about how we make the case for the arts as well, that maybe comes back to what I was talking about around degrowth. I think that we've been stuck since the 90s really in making the case for the arts in economic terms. Even when we talk about the social impact of the arts, or indeed reaching broader audiences, or the social good that the arts can do, we often bring it back again to, and that's going to save the NHS or the social care sector this amount of money. This is what we contribute to the economy. Aren't we great at how good we are at contributing to the economy as a sector? Which is very true, right? We are really good at contributing to the economy. But what other stories can we tell about what we're good at? And how can we make that case really, really strong in a time where we have a government, even now, a government whose main agenda is always going to be in the economic paradigm? I don't know. I mean, I don't have any answers for this, but I just feel like we've been facing cuts for such a long time. And as a freelancer myself, it's exhausting. It's exhausting to live in a climate that you can't afford to make the work that you're making, even, and also having to make the case for the value that you have every day, it feels like sometimes. How can we make a new case for funding? Because obviously the case that we're making isn't strong enough. And maybe that can be about sustainability. Can we make a case that the arts is crucial for a sustainable future? Can we make the arts crucial for a civically healthy future? You know, like, I don't know that we're very good at making that case on a big strategic level. And I think that it would be great if we were better at it, because maybe we'd be less hard up.
Yeah, I'd just love to build on that. Of that, I think it's the funding game is really challenging. But I think it was yesterday that David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, said that climate change is the biggest existential threat that we face. So there is at least a rhetoric from the government that this is an important issue. So I agree that the issue then is about communicating and making a case that maybe needs to be economic in some areas, of saying that if the future is more green jobs, then we need to sort of help people prepare for that and help the cultural change to unlock that. And I think there's cross-sector conversations that can happen to allow more money to come into the arts from other sectors that have an interest in that green transition happening. I think the challenge from my perspective is, how do you sort of access money in the way that protects the conception of the idea and allows the idea and the art to be radical and subversive and all of those things before sort of it maybe goes somewhere else. And it's very difficult to act completely ethically in the system that we're in, as we all know. So you sort of have to find a way to protect the artists and protect the idea and let it be as bold as possible. And that's what's challenging, especially considering almost all artists are freelancers and just have to pay the bills. And also the kind of diversity of the conversation and the fact that this is linked into class, this is linked into race, this is linked into sexuality, gender, and privilege ultimately is something that we need to be aware of when we are accessing that funding and making space sometimes to listen as well as lead. I think that's really key.
100%. Some brilliant points being made there. Just if you're watching the live stream and you have a question for our panelists, do send it put it into the chat at this point. One question we've had to Jessica is just a repeat of the name of the book that you mentioned before, that you were quoting from. And I believe that our lovely Kate McKeown, who's looking after the backstage of this event, is going to post a host of some links, some useful links, including a link to that book in the chat. And that will be on the Members Hub as well. We'll share those so that people can easily access those links for future reference. But just verbally within the conversation, Jessica, if you can repeat the name of that book, please.
Yes, absolutely. It's called The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable by Amitav Ghosh, who is a non-fiction and fiction writer, and I recommend all of his work. Some of it's more climate than others. Great Derangement is particularly good on the climate issue, particularly around modernism and its failings.
Brilliant, thank you. And picking up on that point around thinking laterally around income streams, which I think we're all having to do increasingly in the arts funding environment. Of course, one thing I was researching recently, what are the sort of growth industries in the UK? And I'm told that eco energies, green energy, sustainable energy is one of the biggest sort of growth industries, as we're saying. So it does feel like, in terms of sponsorship and so on going forward, maybe there are going to be some new opportunities there. But as we said, ethical minefield, we all know that as soon as it's a sort of corporate sponsorship relationship, suddenly you find yourself being a mouthpiece for a company that wants particular things. So I think, as Finlay was saying, it's looking at how do we protect the artist's right to explore and to fail and to ask questions that perhaps don't know what the answers will be, and so can't reassure a sponsor or a funder as to what direction the creative process is going to go in. We don't want those restrictions, do we? As we were discussing, we want to create spaces for discussion. Theatres being used for democracy, as in freedom of speech, which we know is under threat within our wider society. And it's interesting, some of the conversations around Manchester Royal Exchange recently, in terms of some of the alarm around theatre administrations sometimes being a bit jumpy around some of the content artistically of shows, which I think is an increasing debate going on in our sector. because musicals take so long to be staged commercially, and every last word is exposed to huge rewriting, and there are no chance elements within most commercial musicals. But it's interesting when we go to things like Finlay talking about the climate cabaret and some more musical theatre medium being used in more quick response to current events. There are some challenges around that in terms of learning music and dance if we want to be impromptu, but maybe there are elements in which the art form is going to be provoked to evolve in certain ways so it can be more swiftly responsive in terms of the way it works. Further thoughts in terms of some of those points that we were talking about the economic sort of environment for making these musicals we want to evolve in, and the scale. Jess?
On the point that you were kind of talking about just then, James, in terms of the messaging of musicals, I think it's quite interesting because there is this kind of pushback and debate happening, especially in commercial musical theatre at the moment, where in some ways there's less room for new intellectual property. There is a lot of adaptation happening. There's a lot of restaging, revivals, or transferring a book into a musical, for example. And this is very exciting for fans of those particular artworks, but it also in some ways can be scary, as especially a maker of original musical theatre, of finding not only might you have a musical that has unorthodox elements like a climate narrative or planet placement, but also how can you put that into an atmosphere where something that's recognizable and familiar is preferable to audiences and producers. And that is a very large question that I can't answer by myself, but I think there is so much opportunity we have in this as an art form to subvert and to communicate in so many different ways, because even if you're staging a production that has a book that can't be changed, the kind of the dance elements, the staging, the set, the costumes, there is so much opportunity within the creativity in that area to include these messages and include these different elements. So I just wanted to say that. Also, in terms of the economic aspect of musical theatre, I think, though it's definitely a minefield, as you said, James, there is this opportunity for theatre makers to try and find alternative funding that itself is sustainable to put on their productions, that they then want to continue that sustainability legacy. So coming back to that idea of renewable energy, it's not going to necessarily fund your entire production, but for people who are lucky enough to be able to install renewable energy generation devices in their venue or their working space, you do have the opportunity to, if you generate excess energy, kind of resell it into smaller networks that don't necessarily have to be those national ones that have a lot of ethical complications. But there are increasingly local community energy networks that can be a place to not necessarily, generate a profit. We won't aim that high, but to bring some alternative sources of funding back into your theatre in a way that you personally can rely on as ethical and in line with your value. And similarly with recycling and material reuse, there is increasingly opportunity to recycle used materials or materials that aren't end of life, but are end of life within the scope of your production, for example, and resell or repurpose them within your theatre or externally to other people you might work with. As I say, not necessarily to make a profit that's going to fund your entire project, but to start bringing in money in ways that you believe are ethical and also can fund that kind of creativity and scope to be subversive. So I think it's really about looking for those opportunities too.
Brilliant. So thanks, Jess. We're nearing the end of our time. There's so much to discuss and such brilliant provocations from all four of you. Thank you so much. I think sort of to bring us towards the close of the discussion, can we finish with from each of the four of you sharing some thoughts on some specific things you hope that we see more of in the next few years in terms of how musical theatre as an art form or individuals working within the sector of musical theatre are just some small adjustments they might make or particular directions of travel, or alongside that, to share a sort of top tip that you would have for people in terms of engaging with these territories, or a recommendation. Who would like to start? Any of those areas. You don't have to answer all of them. Thank you, Jessica. Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to say I'd like to see some of Finlay's work. I can't wait to sort of like engage and to feel, you know, at its very best, musical theatre is like so emotionally transporting. It really is, and I think that there's such power in that. And I think it's an untapped cultural form when it comes to climate and the environment. So yeah, more of that, please. And in terms of a top tip, my recommendation is Emergence magazine, which is online. It's a really beautiful kind of multimedia platform of articles and thought pieces and films about nature and the environment in a diverse and multiplicity of ways.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Malaika.
I just maybe like to return briefly to the hope, fear, or anger, optimism space. As part of the People's Palace of Possibility, we actually had these badges that you could turn one way or the other. And on one end they said more hope than fear, and the other way they said more fear than hope, depending on how you were feeling like that day. Because I think that we go back and forth every day, right? And we should reflect that in our work, because I think we need both. We need fear and anger, and we also need optimism and hope in order to make change. Those things are, you know, a constant balancing act, and they're useful together. And so I guess for me, there's something about how can we root our work in the trouble and stay with the trouble, is kind of Donna Haraway world, but also aim for utopia. And maybe linked to that, a recommendation, Amitav Ghosh is a great one, and I've quoted him as well, but another thinker who I think sits quite close alongside it is a sociologist called Ruth Levine, and she writes about utopia as a method, which maybe riffs back again to this imperfection idea again, that like utopia is no place, right? We'll never actually get there, but it's something that we can always be kind of like tinkering away at and get towards. So I think, how can we use utopia as a method, not only in the creative work that we make, but also in how we run our venues, and how we act as producers, not as well as artists? How can we kind of model and explore and be radical with how we make work and what kind of work we're making within a tricky landscape?
Brilliant. Inspiring words. Thank you.
I'm happy to go. I would say my hope for musical theatre going forward would to see sustainability be part of the conversation as a given, not as an extra or something exceptional. And kind of a tip, I guess, related to that would be, if this is something that at all interests you, is just start thinking about it as early as you can. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're ready to stage a fully sustainable production or do something else along those lines. But the earlier you can have that conversation with the people you work with to make it clear why you're thinking about this and why it's important and where you go from there, the easier it is to start making change that accords with that. And going alongside that, I would say, especially if you're starting out, or in this industry is very common, you're on uncertain ground in some ways, do as much as you can, but don't push yourself to do more than you can at this stage. Change starts, and it can be incremental and small, and we do need to aim for those bigger things, but start with what you can do, and hopefully you will start feeling that hope that we've talked about, that and that empowerment that comes along to keep making that change go further in the future.
That's great. Thank you, Jess. And over to Finlay.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, is that if you're burnt out and anxious and stressed, then you're not going to do your best work. So it starts with you, and then the work comes from there. I think the next 10 years are going to be absolutely crucial in terms of the livability of this planet, to be blunt. So what I'd like to see in the next 5-10 years is artists to allow themselves to be bold, and funders to allow artists to be bold and weird. And there's a reason that we haven't we're not addressing stuff in the way that we need to be, and that's because I think people are sort of following the same track. So I'd love to see more people straying from the path, unexpected collaborations, unexpected partnerships, weird queer work, stuff that sort of gives us new ways of being in the world and understanding each other. And I guess linking to that, my recommendation would be how I sort of started this whole journey was, and by paying gratitude to, there was a lot of work that was created around the time of the HIV/AIDS crisis that was in the realm of musical theatre, but was artists using the form that they knew best to comprehend something of immense scale and difficulty. So like falsettos, rents, like all of these works that came out of that. So I'd recommend, if you're thinking about how to apply climate to your writing, have a listen to some of those musicals, read the books, and see how those artists grapple with something that is incomprehensible, but kind of try to find beauty and community and hope within that. So that'd be my recommendation.
Brilliant, beautiful. Thank you, Finlay. Thank you, all of you. It's brilliant. Just to build on that as well, that yeah, it's true. When we look through the history of musical theatre as an art form, often in the most commercial of spaces like Broadway and London's West End, we're seeing people that have been putting across some of the most socially progressive narratives of their time. And they really have had change as a result in terms of people's values and their views on various different areas of social cohesion and what's acceptable within society. I'm really hopeful that we'll see increasingly musicals that have individual characters whose actions are going to inspire others in terms of musical theatre, in terms of the climate crisis. We know that it's overwhelming when we look at situations that involve a whole population, and we need to see more stories where it's one individual and how the climate crisis is impacting on them as a character that is going to change hearts and minds. We need more of those individual stories, I think, for us to be able to sort of make commitments to change as a society. And a quick final recommendation is the podcast Accidental Gods. This comes from Jen Toxwig, another musical theatre writer, introduced me to this recently. It's a brilliant podcast that's looking at creatives and thinkers on the forefront of looking at societal change, which I think has been a key theme in this discussion this evening, looking at how we can think outside, beyond our existing ways of thinking of things, how we can use our creativity to imagine things beyond what the status quo has. This has been a really inspiring and very rich discussion. So I'd really like to, from the bottom of my heart, thank our panelists, Finlay, Jess, Malaika, and Jessica. Thank you for your inspiring words and actions within your wider careers and lives. You're already being the change you want to see, and that's so inspiring, I think, to all of us. So thank you so much for sharing some of your insights and your wisdom and your hopes with us. And I look forward to further discussions in the future. Hopefully this will emanate and cross-pollinate your wider discussions, all of you who are listening to this now and in the future. We look forward to you continuing to engage with us on this topic as we have further discussions. It's an open-ended conversation for sure. Thank you so much for joining.